December 5th, 2022. Qatar. Another World Cup dream ending too soon. But that night was bigger than one miss, one save, or one result. Croatia did not just beat Japan. Luka Modric and his team exposed them. They showed Japan every flaw that still separated them from the world's elite. The lack of control, the lack of killer instinct, the physical gap, and the inability to survive the biggest moments. But here is what made Japan different. They did not make excuses. They did not panic. They took that defeat like a diagnosis and turned it into a blueprint. This is the story of how Croatia broke Japan and accidentally helped build the monster they are becoming today. So let's start with the autopsy. Because before you can understand the monster, you have to understand everything that was broken. The first weakness Croatia exposed was the most painful and the most revealing. Penalties. When that match went to a shootout, Moriyasu, the head coach, was later asked who he had chosen to take the kicks. He had asked the players to decide among themselves, to volunteer, to raise their hands. Think about what that means. The biggest moment in 4 years of work, the single most pressure-soaked situation in all of sport. And there was no plan, no designated order built over months, no cold, rehearsed process, just a group of exhausted men, after 120 minutes of football, being asked who felt brave enough to decide the fate of a nation. 3 of them walked up, one after another, swallowed whole by the occasion. And it wasn't even Japan's first time. They had now lost both of the penalty shootouts they had ever taken at a World Cup. This wasn't bad luck striking once. This was a pattern. A team that, when the game stopped being about flow and started being about nerve, simply did not have the machinery to cope. Afterward, Moriyasu admitted the obvious. He said penalties were a mix of luck and training. He praised the Croatian goalkeeper, but he conceded that his players should have done better and that this was something Japan would have to work on going forward. And one of his own players, Ritsu Doan, cut even deeper. He said the real problem was never the penalties at all. The real problem was that Japan could not finish the job inside those 120 minutes. Which brings us straight to weakness number 2, and this one was philosophical. Japan, in 2022, were a magnificent underdog. And that was the trap. They had beaten Germany. They had beaten Spain. 2 former world champions, dismantled by a team that absorbed pressure, sat deep, soaked up everything, and then struck like lightning on the counterattack. It was thrilling, it was historic, and it was a mask. Because the moment Japan was expected to be the better team, the moment they had to take a game by the throat and control it rather than react to it, they fell apart. They lost to Costa Rica, a far weaker side, in a game where they had the ball and simply had no idea what to do with it. And against Croatia, the instant they took the lead, you saw it again. They didn't push to bury the game. They retreated. They invited Croatia onto them. They sat back and hoped to survive. And a team like Croatia, marshaled by a midfielder as intelligent as Modric, will always punish you for that. Modric slowed the game down, controlled the tempo, and let the pressure do the work. Japan had no answer because Japan had never learned how to dominate. Only how to ambush. A counterpuncher can win you a fight, but a counterpuncher cannot win you a tournament. Sooner or later, somebody makes you lead the dance. And in 2022, Japan could not dance. The third weakness had haunted them for decades. Japan did not have a striker. For years, this had been the great hole at the center of the team. They produced wonderful wingers, brilliant technical midfielders, intelligent fullbacks. But a genuine, clinical, world-class number 9, the kind of finisher who turns one half chance into a goal and ends knockout matches, Japan simply never had one. Their forwards converted a painfully low share of their chances, and it showed up in exactly the games that mattered most. Against deep, organized, stubborn defenses against teams that refused to open up, Japan would knock politely on the door for 90 minutes and never kick it down. They had a habit, a fatal one, of trying to walk the ball into the net. One pass too many. Always one pass too many when what they needed was someone willing to just pull the trigger. And the fourth weakness was the one living inside their own heads. The glass ceiling. 4 times Japan had reached the round of 16. In 2002, in 2010, in 2018, and now in 2020. Not once in their entire history had they reached a World Cup quarterfinal. In fact, they held one of the loneliest records in the sport. More World Cup matches played than any other nation on the planet without ever once making the final 8. It had become a curse, an invisible wall, and the worst kind of wall because it was psychological. Every Japanese team that reached that stage carried the weight of every Japanese team that had failed there before. Croatia didn't just beat a team that night. They beat a history. They beat a fear. So there it was, the full autopsy. No process under pressure, no ability to control a game, no killer in front of goal, and a mental ceiling built from decades of disappointment. 4 wounds, all exposed on a single night by a single opponent. Most countries would have looked at that list and despaired. Japan looked at it and saw a to-do list. But here is what the rest of the world missed. Japan were never really building a team. They were building a system, and it had been running for almost 20 years before Modric ever walked onto that pitch. Go back to the year 2005. The Japanese Football Association sat down and wrote a document that the rest of the world found almost laughable. They called it the JFA Declaration, and in it, they made 2 promises: that by the year 2050, Japan would have a football family 10 million strong, and that by 2050, Japan would not just compete at a World Cup, they would win it. People scoffed. A country with no World Cup pedigree, no history of producing elite individuals, announcing a 50-year plan to lift the most coveted trophy in sport. It sounded like fantasy. But what the rest of the world missed was the genius hidden inside it. Japan had stopped thinking in 4-year cycles. They had started thinking in generations. They were not trying to get lucky at one tournament. They were trying to engineer a country that produced world beaters on a conveyor belt, so reliably that talent would no longer be an accident. And then, in July of 2022, just months before Qatar, they took the next step. The association formally published a national footballing philosophy. They called it Japan's Way, and the method behind it is the single most important thing to understand in this entire story. Japan's Way works backwards. It starts by imagining the finished product, the ideal Japanese team, the one capable of winning a World Cup. And then it asks a simple, relentless question. What has to be true for that team to exist? What does the striker need to be? What does the midfielder need to be? How do the youth academies need to teach? How do the coaches need to coach? And it reverse engineers every single layer of the pyramid, from a 6-year-old kicking a ball in a schoolyard all the way up to the senior national team, so that every level is teaching the same ideas in the same language, pointing in the same direction. They even gave it a structure, 4 pillars, treated as one. The national team, youth development, coaching education, and grassroots football. The rule was that all 4 had to share the same knowledge, the same philosophy, the same destination. A talented kid in Osaka and a national team coach in Europe would be speaking the same footballing language because the entire country had agreed on what that language was. Now, lay that machine over the 4 weaknesses Croatia exposed and watch what happens. But before we get to the fixes, you need to understand the engine driving all of it. And it is not a tactic. It is a mindset. The Japanese have a word for it. Kaizen. Continuous improvement. The idea that you do not transform through one heroic leap, but through 1,000 tiny, relentless, unglamorous adjustments, repeated forever, never satisfied, never finished. It is the same philosophy that built the Japanese car industry into the most reliable on Earth. And it is exactly the philosophy a footballing nation needs when its problems are not about talent, but about details. About the half yard of movement, the 1 extra second of composure, the penalty taken with process instead of hope. A nation that lives by Kaizen does not look at 4 humiliating weaknesses and feel shame. It looks at them and feels purpose. Because each one is just another thing to improve. And there is something else baked into the culture that made this possible. Something you can see long before any player touches a ball. You have probably noticed it. The Japanese fans who stay behind after every match to clean the stadium. The players who leave the locker room spotless with a thank you note even after a defeat. That is not a marketing gimmick. It comes from 2 old ideas that run through the entire society. Suji, the discipline of cleaning, of taking responsibility for your own space. And Reiji, respect and gratitude toward everyone around you. These are the values of a culture obsessed with doing small things correctly, with humility over and over, without needing applause for it. Now ask yourself what kind of footballing nation that produces. One that will happily run the same defensive shape 10,000 times. One that treats discipline as freedom rather than a cage. One perfectly built to chase the kind of improvement nobody else has the patience for. And crucially, they refuse to simply copy somebody else's homework. When Japan built its philosophy, it studied the famous blueprints. The German model, the French model, the English approach to youth development. And it concluded that those belonged to countries already sitting at the summit, with histories and resources Japan did not share. So instead of imitating the giants, Japan looked at nations that had punched above their weight from a similar starting point, places like Wales and Iceland, and built something of its own. A philosophy designed for Japan by Japan, for Japan's body, Japan's culture, and Japan's place in the world. They did not want to become a copy of Germany. They wanted to become the first proper version of Japan. So they improved them. Start with the deepest change of all, the intellectual one. For decades, Japan had a quiet inferiority complex baked into the way they played. They knew their individual players were not as strong as Europe's or South America's, so they leaned on the one thing they could control. Teamwork, collective movement, everyone covering for everyone. It was smart, it was necessary, and it had a ceiling. Because when you build your entire identity around compensating for weak individuals, you are admitting every single day that your individuals are weak. So the philosophy changed. The new goal, stated plainly by the people running Japan's development, was to build strong individuals who choose to play as a team, not weak players forced to combine out of necessity. Strong players, good enough to win a duel, to beat a man, to score from nothing, who then add the Japanese teamwork on top. The team was no longer the crutch. The team became the weapon, and the individual finally became the foundation. That single shift in thinking is the reason everything else became possible. Then came the science. Japan had spent its whole footballing life being told it was physically inferior, too small, too weak, built to be bullied by bigger nations. So they attacked that belief head-on, with data. They built individualized fitness programs, tailored to each player's body rather than a one-size-fits-all routine. They obsessed over recovery, treating rest itself as a form of training rather than the absence of it. And slowly, the idea that Japan was a physically weak nation stopped being a fact and started being history. They were not going to outmuscle Europe overnight, but they were never going to be pushed off the ball as easily again. But all the science and philosophy in the world means nothing without the right environment to harden players in. And this is where Japan made its smartest, most patient bet of all. They sent their best young talent to Europe, and not to make up the numbers, to compete. Every weekend, in the Premier League, in the Bundesliga, in the Dutch and Spanish leagues, a Japanese player was now being asked to win a physical duel against a grown professional who wanted to embarrass him. To make a decision in a tenth of a second with a crowd screaming down at him. To survive and then to thrive. Iron sharpens iron. And after a few seasons of that, the timid, technically lovely Japanese player of the old stereotype was quietly replaced by something else entirely. A player who had stopped fearing Europe because he played against Europe every single week and had learned in his bones that he belonged there. The strong individual the new philosophy demanded was never going to be built in a classroom in Tokyo. It was forged in the hardest leagues on the planet, one duel at a time. By 2026, this was no longer a team of a few brave exports surrounded by domestic players. It was a team where the captain anchored the midfield of a Premier League heavyweight, where defenders started for German giants, where the bench was stacked with men who would walk into most national sides on earth. Now watch them solve the individual weaknesses, one by one. The striker problem. The decades-old hole at the heart of the team. They did not import a solution, they grew one. They sent their forwards into the toughest finishing schools in the world, the European leagues, and waited for the system to do its work. And it did. By 2026, Japan had what it had craved for 30 years, a genuine number 9. A striker leading the line who had gone to the Netherlands and finished as the top scorer in the entire Dutch league. A player who could hold the ball up, move in the box, and finish with both feet and his head. Behind him, another big, physical forward built specifically to break down the deep, stubborn defenses that used to frustrate Japan to tears. The thing that had undone them against Croatia, the inability to break a low block, suddenly had an answer wearing the number 9 shirt. The control problem, the inability to dominate a game. This one fell to the manager. And here Japan made a decision that stunned the football world. Rather than blaming Moriyasu for the round of 16 exit and throwing him out, the association did the opposite. They kept him. They broke their own tradition and handed him a second World Cup cycle, making him the first manager in Japanese history to lead the team into back-to-back tournaments. Because the system did not want a fresh start. The system wanted evolution. It wanted the man who knew exactly what had gone wrong to be the one who fixed it. And there was a deeper reason Moriyasu, of all people, barrier. Because he had already lived inside the worst one in his country's history. Back in 1993, as a player, Moriyasu was on the pitch for the night Japanese football still speaks about in hushed tones. The agony of Doha. Seconds away from qualifying for their first ever World Cup, Japan conceded an injury time equalizer that tore the dream away at the very last moment. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what it felt like to watch a nation's hope collapse in the final seconds. And he had spent the rest of his life turning that very specific pain into something useful. A belief that the worst moments are not endings, they are instructions. He was not just a coach who understood Japan's glass ceiling from the outside. He was a man who had once been crushed beneath one, and had spent 30 years learning how to lift it. And Moriyasu changed. The reactive, counterpunching Japan of 2022 became something far more dangerous. He reshaped the team to control matches rather than survive them. He built a structure with extra freedom for his attackers and his fullbacks, designed to keep the ball, to push teams back, to dominate territory, instead of conceding it and hoping. The underdog that only knew how to ambush was being retrained, deliberately, to lead the dance. To hold a lead by attacking, not by hiding. He also weaponized the one thing Japan now had in abundance: depth. Moriyasu started holding back some of his most explosive attackers, not because they were not good enough to start, but so he could unleash them in the final half hour against legs that were already tired. He stopped chasing games and started closing them, changing matches from the bench with the calm of a man who had options for days, which leaves the penalties themselves and the glass ceiling. And these two, in the end, came down to the same thing. Mentality, the replacement of hope with belief and luck with process. Japan stopped being a team that was simply happy to be at a World Cup. You could hear it in the way they spoke. Where once a Japanese player would have talked humbly about gaining experience and doing their country proud, the players and the manager now said something that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They said, out loud, with a straight face, that they were there to win the whole thing. Not to reach the knockouts. Not to finally break the round of 16 curse. To win it. The fear that Croatia had exposed, the weight of all that history, was being replaced by something colder and harder. The quiet, dangerous confidence of a team that no longer believed it belonged among the best. It simply knew it. And here is the proof that the whole machine was working. By the time Japan rolled into the 2026 World Cup, the evidence was everywhere, in the records and the rankings rather than in any single highlight. They arrived as the highest-ranked nation in all of Asia. They had hardened a defense that used to be their soft underbelly into something that kept clean sheets for fun. They had a striker who scored in bunches. They had a captain anchoring their midfield who had become one of the most respected defensive players in the Premier League. They had a squad so deep in European talent that they could lose one of their very best attackers to injury before the tournament even began and barely break stride. The bench alone would have been a respectable starting 11. Everything Croatia had exposed in 2022 had been answered. The lack of a striker, answered. The inability to control a game, answered. The physical fragility, answered. The reactive identity, answered. And the fear, the glass ceiling, the curse, was being attacked not with hope, but with the unshakable belief of a team that had spent 4 years methodically removing every reason to doubt itself. That is the monster Croatia built. Not with a beating, with a diagnosis. Because think about what would have happened if Japan had never lost that night. If they had scraped through the shootout and limped into a quarterfinal, they would have celebrated. They would have called it progress, and they would have learned almost nothing, waiting to betray them later against a better team on a bigger stage. The win would have been a lie. The defeat told the truth. And the truth is the only thing a nation built on continuous improvement can actually use. You cannot fix what a victory lets you ignore. By being just good enough and just ruthless enough to win, Croatia and Modric did Japan the cruelest and greatest favor in their footballing history. They refused to let Japan hide. There is a strange and beautiful symmetry to it all. The very qualities that made Croatia so dangerous in 2022. The experience, the game intelligence, the patience, the refusal to panic, were the qualities of a team standing at the peak of a golden generation. Croatia were not faster than Japan. They were not younger. They were not some unstoppable machine. They were simply wiser. And in that wisdom, they showed Japan exactly what it still lacked. That is what makes the defeat so important. Because the pain Croatia gave Japan did not disappear after the final whistle. It stayed. It followed them home. It became part of the conversation, part of the planning, part of the national obsession. Every saved penalty, every wasted chance, every moment where Croatia slowed the game down and Japan could not speed it back up, all of it became evidence. Modric, one of the greatest midfielders the sport has ever produced, may one day look back and realize that one of the most important things he ever did on a football pitch was not a pass, not a trophy, not a highlight. It was teaching an entire football nation exactly what it needed to become. Because the monster was not born in 2026, it was assembled. Slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. From a blueprint written in 2005, sharpened by a philosophy published in 2022, and powered by a culture that treats every weakness as nothing more than the next thing to fix. Croatia simply handed Japan the final piece. The list. The painful, honest, complete list of everything that was still wrong. And a country that lives by the idea that nothing is ever finished, that improvement never stops, that every defeat is just data, was always going to be the most dangerous place on earth to handle a list like that. So the next time you watch this Japanese team control a match, it would once have merely survived, finish a chance it would once have wasted, and carry itself with the calm of a side that fears no one. Remember where it came from. And the night Japan finally saw the full distance between being dangerous and being truly elite. Because Croatia and Luka Modric did not end Japan's dream that night. They drew at the map, and Japan, in the quietest and most terrifying way possible, started following it. Like and subscribe for more documentaries on Japan and the World Cup. Until next time.